Good morning and welcome to the June 20th, 2024 Finance Committee meeting for the Lee's Summit School District. We'll begin with item 1.01, contracts $15,000 and less. As you look at the list of items, these are one fairly lengthy, but that's typical for this time of year as we've have items on this list that are related to the end of last school year, wrapping up those activities, but also a number of items on here that are in place to begin our school year. Are there any questions regarding any of the items that are on this list of $15,000 or less? Thank you. Moving on to item 1.02, contracts of $15,000 or more. Similar to our last agenda item, this list is longer than normal, but once again related to mostly beginning of the school year as we prep for the start. And there are a number of items on here, both on the instructional side as well as the operation side. And as a reminder, some of these items will be pulled out as items of discussion for our meeting today. The threshold to pull an item off of this list and into our meeting is one, it's a new item, and two, it's an item, it's a renewal, but it's over a certain threshold for increased cost. So as I said, there are a number of items that we'll discuss later in this meeting. Are there any questions about any item on this list that is not going to be discussed later in the meeting? All right, thank you. Moving on to 1.03, inventory health services. I'll turn this over to Mrs. Battaglia.
Good morning, everyone. Currently, our inventory warehouse stocks approximately 100 items that are related to health services. And those could be anything from a cracker or a lifesaver on up to bandages and other complex items that our nurses, we've worked with our nurses to stock for them. This is a 1-year contract, and it, if it is approved by the board, would commence right after the board meeting and then would carry on through June of 2025. We don't have one particular medical supply place that can provide us with every item on the list. And something that we've kind of learned through COVID and are still kind of seeing a little bit of a trend with is that there are some long lead times that are still out there on a few things. So what we like to do is award that contract to 4 vendors that you will see listed in the packet: Henry Schein, Medco, School Health, McKesson, I believe, is also on there. Yes. And those are the 4 that we are wanting to award this 1-year contract to, so that we will be able to get the supplies that we need in a timely manner, and then also the exact supplies that our nurses have spec'd. So are there any questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Battaglia. Moving on to 1.04, Apple computer and tablet replacement. Dr. Whaley, I think you have a couple of items following this as well.
Yep. Good morning, everybody. So this first item, 1.04, is for our Apple computers and iPads. Those are used throughout the district. Most of them are for curricular needs, so broadcasting labs, publications, things like that. Then we also have a number of iPads that are used for special education students, some one-off needs, for instance, to run audiovisual controllers. There'll be some teachers that use them for different coursework and different purposes. And this year, as well as last year, we worked really hard to reach out to building administration when it came to iPads because we had a lot of excess. And so we sent lists that were not part of a specified curricular need. And we asked each building administrator to evaluate and say, yes, this one needs to be replaced or this one doesn't. and provide a justification. So we were able to actually shrink that iPad number down. I don't have the number in front of me, but by about a couple hundred. So that's that item. Does anybody have any questions? All right, I can scoot on to 1.05, which is Dell Technologies. Very similar. This is our annual computer replacement for staff and students. You can see the quantities there. It's quite a big replacement year this year, and that's just due to how things fall in the replacement cycle. Most of our desktops will run 4 or 5 years. Laptops, when they hit that year 4 mark, they're definitely time for replacement. So that's this year's dollar amount and replacement cycle devices. Any questions? All right, thank you. And then Dr. Sheldon, you want me to run through the next one? You're on mute.
Sir, thank you. Yes, why don't you begin? Also, we have Ryan Hall here as well. I know we have been working in tandem to bring this agenda item forward.
Sure. So this year, just for the community, we have audio enhancement devices in K-1-2 classrooms right now, and they're well over 10 years old. I think they're in that 12-year-old mark. It was before I came to the district that those were installed. And audio enhancement allows for a teacher to wear a microphone and broadcast their voice in a very balanced level to a classroom. So kids can hear better, retention's better, and there's a lot of research on the benefits of that, especially in a K-1-2 classroom where it's really loud. So we had actually proposed in the budget a replacement of that system because they're getting close. But as technology has changed, it's always kind of important to evaluate for the future as well as the present. And we brought this forward as a pilot at Miller Park. So it's taking audio enhancement in a lot of those spaces, which is that microphone that the teacher would wear, but also tacking on a notification button as a part of that microphone. So in the event of a need of an administrator to come down a room, there's an emergency, things like that, the teacher can key the button, or any staff member will have a button. They can key that button and it will provide an alert back to the main office so the administration can respond pretty quickly. When that alert goes out, it actually triangulates, depending on how the transmitter is paired, but it will either triangulate a location or it's paired directly to an audio enhancement system. And so on the panel that the office would monitor, they get a pretty accurate location of where the need is, which results in a quicker response.
So along with that work on the audio enhancement systems that we provide our staff and our students, we also, Mr. Hall has been researching wearable devices that can be used in moments of, I'll say, crisis or need, when we need to alert the office about something. And so it seemed appropriate that we would coordinate these two systems since that opportunity is there. Some of the feedback we received is that staff wearing the audio enhancement mic, but also then having this other, I'll say, key card, which is normally what you see with these devices, and that you would hold and press the button 3 times or 8 times, depending on the system that you would purchase. It seemed wise and prudent to at least explore the system that would allow us kind of have a one-stop shop, if you will, for both audio enhancement, but also notification during an emergency. Mr. Hall, is there anything else that you would like to share?
Not really. I think it's great that we were able to find a system to piggyback on an infrastructure that we already have within the district, and again, it's something that we've already utilized for that audio enhancement, and this is just a step up access. So, but this is, like Kevin said, this is designed to be utilized in when a critical incident or a crisis where you need assistance or response, and can be used in tandem with mass alert systems and mass notification systems that we already have within the district.
So this is a pilot project at Miller Park. If it goes well there, we would look to bring forward an opportunity to expand it at other sites. This, and if it really does go well, and we feel like this is something we want to deploy district-wide, this would be potentially part of a future bond project list of bond projects. We'll stop there. Are there any questions?
I did have just some additional questions because I asked a few for our board packet as well, and I'm just I think this is great. Don't get me wrong at all. I think this is a great step with safety. I'm just curious about the cost overall to scale it, and I know we're kind of talking through maybe doing a bond project with it, so we would have some funding there. But have we looked at other companies that do this just to get an understanding of where the costs for this system lie, like in the comparison to other systems? And I know this one ties into our existing system, so there's some benefit there. But aside from just functionality, have we explored the cost of other systems aside from just this one?
Yes, we have a lot of other systems utilize more of an annual based payment versus infrastructure, our own purchase infrastructure. For example, Centegix, which is utilized by some of our neighboring school districts, you're looking at a 3 to 5 year contract that looking at $2 to $3 million just over that 3 to 5 years. And then, you know, that's an annual purchase and install cost that we would pay to them versus utilizing the backbone of a system like this that we already have in place or that we utilize for audio enhancements. And this would just be an added feature to piggyback on that, especially if there's a potential, like Kevin said, you know, of putting this in all classrooms K through 12 versus just K through 2 at some point.
Okay, so it piggybacks off of the audio system that would already be installed. So currently we only have this audio system installed K2. So we would be installing, would we have to install the audio piece in order to utilize the safety button piece? So every single classroom would have to then have the audio side in order to utilize the other safety feature?
No, there's other, so like not every, at Miller Park, not every, so every classroom would have the audio enhancement, but there's a lot of other spaces that will have the boxes or the potential to alert this area, triangulate, like Kevin said. But it's not the audio perspective of it in other spaces isn't required. But having that backbone that we use it in those classrooms. So if a teacher is paired to that classroom, that audio, and for her to utilize that audio, her or him to utilize that audio enhancement. When they activate their button, it'll tell you specifically what classroom they're in versus having to triangulate throughout hallways or unpaired devices.
Okay, so the AV side of it allows for better location. Okay, gotcha.
Right.
And
But
just,
it's not necessary.
yeah, and also to clarify too, so our existing K12, like I said, they're really old. So we've got to basically pick a box. So if we wanted to move forward with the additional ability to make this a safe system with the emergency button functionality, we would have to pick a different box versus a much lower cost that just provides audio enhancement. So before we made that investment at K12, we wanted to pilot this system to make sure we were basically heading down the right path and that we were exploring, you know, all capabilities of the system. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I don't disagree with the approach at all. I'm just trying to figure out what would have you kind of already budgeted what it would look like to do this in the entire school? Because I'm assuming there's like some sort of per classroom estimate that you could come up with.
Yeah,
Do we know what that scope looks like?
They provided a rough per classroom in their presentation. It came up to be around, was it $2,000 a room, Ryan?
Yeah.
And that was a ballpark. When we scoped out Miller Park, they actually come out and they do a walkthrough of each space. And that's where we can say, this space doesn't need audio enhancement because it's too small. This one does. This one needs more speakers. So it's really kind of customized. But that $2,000 room number is a really good starting point.
And the 2,000 is that for the audio and the safe piece of it?
Yes.
That's for both. Okay. So what's your threshold, I guess, doing this pilot program? What are the targets you're looking for in order to decide this is the way we want to go forward and try to explore this for the entire district?
So we would, as we go through the year, probably quarterly, meet with the staff at Miller Park and get their feedback on how the audio enhancement features are working, but also how the system has worked from the safe standpoint. Both the teachers and as well as the other staff members who will be wearing the devices, but also administratively, this notification not only gets pushed to the office where there is a panel, if you will, that will indicate where the staff member is, but also it'll push to an app that the administrators have. And so how that's working, we will look for reduced response time for the administrators to respond to an event somewhere in the building. So hopefully the hope is that staff will be able to quickly notify the office, and then in turn, the administrator will be able to quickly respond, or other staff members would be able quickly to respond to that space where help is needed.
Okay. Okay. So I understand the piece about us owning the system versus having to pay a contract fee. So over the course of kind of testing the system as well, is there a plan to just make sure there's nothing else out there? I'm always wary when we only have one number. So not having another system to compare to in terms of the cost and benefit, because we're not exploring, and I'm not disagreeing with this, that systems where you have to pay a contract fee versus just owning the system.
So as we discussed during our board retreat, it's probably somewhere in January, February, March, we would, and maybe a little bit earlier, probably more like January, February, we would put together the specs and the scope, push it out as an RFP. And the hope would be, if this is going well, within the scope and the specs of the RFP, we would marry these systems if it seems to be working well. But if we get through this and it's not working as well as we want it to, or just for whatever reason we want to go a different direction, we would then modify those scopes and that spec, those specs accordingly. One other element of this system, we mentioned that at first this discussion started with two separate discussions about audio enhancement as well as notification during emergencies, and marrying those two. But this system also has eventually the ability to expand to be our building's intercom and PA systems.
Mm-hmm.
So as you will see later on at Meadow Lane, we're bringing forward a board agenda item that is addressing the needs of our intercom and PA system at Meadow Lane, and we're having this systematically replaced around the district. This could also become that system for us as well. And so not only are we taking care of two issues here, we could eventually maybe even take care of a third issue, a third need that the district has with our intercom and PA system using this system. But
Okay.
To answer your question, we will go back out to bid, and we will, based on our findings from the school year, it will impact our scope and our specs that we push out in the RFP in January or February.
Understood. Okay. I think this is a great venture, by the way. I think it's a really good thing, especially at Miller Park. I know there've been some concerns there. So I think this is a great place to start. And hopefully our staff see that as a step that the district is taking to ensure that they feel safe and like they can, get help if they need it. So I think it's great. Thank you for doing the work on this, and I look forward to seeing how it goes.
Well, we thank you for your questions, and we do, just more broadly talking about safety and security. We are always looking for opportunities to keep our students and our staff safe and secure, and this seems to be a next step in that effort. And so we're excited to see how this pilot goes, and hopefully it goes really well, and we can move forward with it.
Definitely. I hope so too. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Moving on to 1.07. We have Dr. Herzog and Amy Krinke online.
Hello, good morning.
Morning.
So this item here is for instrument rental. This is targeting our beginning band and string students, and those students do rent their instruments. So this isn't necessarily a cost to the district, but rather a way to ensure that our families have access to quality instruments that meet our district specifications. For strings rental, there's one rental night for the entire district, so it's a very large event. So we're suggesting 3 vendors to provide those services. And then for the band rental, we have one evening event for each middle school, and so we are suggesting one vendor for that because that is quite a bit smaller to serve the families. But this is an awesome way to make sure that our families have access to quality things and that they can also be repaired when they break without them having to run around to the different vendors around town. Does anyone have any questions about this?
Mrs. Krinky, does this process, as you mentioned, it doesn't cost the district anything, but
Correct.
does it? I'm assuming this process not only provides more opportunity for our families to have access to these instruments, but also more competitive pricing, because then they can pick and choose which vendor based on price as well as quality of instrument and that.
Yes, absolutely. And we did put this out and we did receive various vendors come in. We were able to compare the prices and these are all very competitive with each other. So, you know, if a family shows up to string rental night, they'll have 3 vendors to choose from, but they will ensure that they will leave with a quality product and one that is competitive with the others that is similar. So it really is a great service to our families.
Very good, thank you. Are there any other questions?
I do have a quick question. So for instrument rentals for our students who maybe don't have the means, is there a program that aligns maybe with like free and reduced lunch qualifications that our students our students are made aware of as well, and the families are made aware of so that they don't feel like they don't have the opportunity to access.
Yes,
Um,
that is a
yeah.
great question. Of course, we want any and all student to have access to play an instrument in LSR7. And we use a program called Band of Angels, which is geared exactly toward those students who are on free and reduced lunch who may not have the financial means to play. And Band of Angels provides those instruments for free or very reduced cost for students.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
How do families find out about that?
We tell them about it when they sign up for band or strings. We want to make sure that they know this is for everybody. This isn't just for the people who can afford it, and we make that program available to the families.
Is
We have
there a
lots of
possibility?
kids on it.
Sorry, is there a possibility that those families or those students don't even sign up because they're worried about that piece, and then they don't find out that the instrument would be covered for them because they don't even approach the class or the interest out of concern for that embarrassment or potentially just not even knowing that program exists?
We haven't discovered that just because every student in our elementary, for strings, for example, because that's the first one that starts in the 5th grade, every student is introduced to the stringed instruments and they make their decision on whether or not they want to be involved in the program before even learning about the rental program. So we get an idea of who's interested first, and then the instrument rental piece comes later.
Okay,
But we always find a way for a student to have an instrument that desires to play.
okay, that's great. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's good to
Yeah,
know.
you're welcome. And music is, you know, I should add, like it is such a place for students who may not thrive in other areas of academia, often thrive in our music programs. So it's a really important piece to have all those kids involved.
Oh, I completely agree. My kids play piano and
Yeah.
I think it's a wonderful gift and I want every kid to be able to have music and art if they want it. So I fully support.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Mrs. Krinky, and to just introduce Ms. Krinky. She is our curriculum coordinator for music and has done so very well for the last number of years. So very, very fortunate to have her. She's incredibly talented and gifted, and we really appreciate her bringing her talents and gifts to the work.
Thanks, Dr. Shelton.
Moving on to item 1.08, Dell Technologies. This is for our nutrition services department, and Mrs. Danella and probably Dr. Whaley will jump in on this as well.
Hi, good morning. Every year we try to purchase laptops. We use the laptops for our breakfast program, so we're mobile and we meet the students at the doors. And our monitors are touchscreen because those are at our point of sale service, and we want to make sure and get the kids through as fast as we can. And we have a set equipment replacement plan, and we've worked with Dr. Whaley's team on when we should replace, and they help us get the quotes, and these are the items that we need to replace this year. Are there any questions?
Right, Mrs. Danella, thank you. Moving on to 1.09, 2024-25 meal prices. Gonna continue with you.
Okay, every year the USDA puts out a tool that we have to use. It's called Paid Lunch Equity Tool, and we enter in how many meals and our price of meals the previous October, and that helps us calculate where we should be. So we have equity in between free meals and paid meals. And this year we need to increase our elementary lunches by 10 cents and secondary by 20. And doing it, the 10-cent difference, we can use the average weighted amount so we stay in compliance with the guidelines. That would bring our elementary meals up to $3 for lunch this year, and the secondary meals up to $3.20. And that puts us pretty much in line with all the other districts, the suburban districts in our area. Are there any questions?
Mrs. Danella, just refresh my memory. I believe the actual calculation recommended we would raise our meal prices 25 cents. Was it?
Correct.
Okay.
And we can round down by 5 cents and still be compliant.
So, okay. So the actual calculation requested that we do it more, but we felt like we could obviously be in compliance, but also help our families by not increasing.
Exactly.
Okay. Are there any questions? All right, thank you. Moving on to section 2, facilities, 2.01, and Mr. Gurrell will take the next 4 items.
All right, thank you. The first item on the agenda is a final closeout change order for the Miller Park project. Students have now moved into the great building, and it's really exciting to see that whole campus get used now. There were various items on this change order, some of them relating to building codes that were found during inspection. There were also some owner items that we decided to use some contingency for, things like improving flashing, drains in the showers at the great building, and some additional security cameras. So I will be glad to answer any questions you may have on this change order. All right, so the next item, as was mentioned earlier, is a contract with Electronic Corporation of America to replace the head end of the intercom at Meadow Lane. We are not replacing the entire system, the speakers and the wiring. They are a newer age. And so we are taking the opportunity just to replace the head end, the control unit that has been causing us problems. So we did only receive one bid for this from ECA. They have done our last few projects and have been low bids. We do know from previous experience that this is a really good number for that head end, and all of the time it takes to cut and re-land every wire in the building. So we are recommending award, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
I don't have any questions, but I did let Linda know that the company name was incorrect on board meeting packet. I haven't looked at the board meeting packet to see if that got updated, but it's Electrical Corporation of America, and I didn't know if it reflected that on the contract as well. But I figured the name probably needed to be correct, and I only know that because I work with them, and that's why the line got pulled by me, specifically because I have a business relationship with them, and I'm going to abstain from the vote. But it's not because I object to the
Okay.
contract or anything like that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We did get the date modified in the contract and the agenda item.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks.
Yep, thank you. Okay, the next item on the agenda is to approve the facility use fee schedule for fiscal year 25. And as you will remember, we have a board policy KG that requires approval of a facility use fee schedule for each fiscal year. So we have a quality focus team that meets to review the fees as well as any outstanding concerns that may be out there. We met on May 31st and are recommending the fee schedules for the 3 facilities in the district, or the 3 different areas in the district that have fee schedules. There is one for just the district in general. There is one for the Missouri Innovation Campus and another one for the Aquatic Center. So at this time, we are not recommending any increase to the district fee schedule or Missouri Innovation Campus. If you remember last year, we did increase the labor side of the fees just to be commensurate with the salary increases that have been given. We may, in the next year or two, look at some fee schedule increase, but still feel like the hourly rates that we have are adequate to reimburse us for our cost. There are some increases shown on the Aquatic Center fee schedule. You'll notice off to the side in the top column, there is a separate fee for the for out-of-district users, giving our patrons the advantage of their tax dollars supporting the facility. So there is a 30% cost increase for those activities for people who live outside of the district. There was also a separation on the Aquatic Center fee schedule for adult and youth activities that Mr. Pryor recommended. So I'll be glad to answer any questions if I'm able. Okay.
Question.
Yes.
Do we monitor the usage of these facilities throughout the year and then compare year over year how well our facilities are being utilized by the public?
Yeah, we have reports that can be run with our facility use system. I'll just going to be completely transparent. Right now, we are in the process of switching over to some new software that'll be used across the district at the start of the school year. It'll give us some better tracking system. The older software we're using now is a little limited in how we can pull data and reporting. But yes, we do especially with our larger user groups, we do track usage. And honestly, frankly, like almost all of our soccer fields, outdoor play areas are used, and are even could use more in the community. Our basketball and gym space for basketball and volleyball is 100% utilized through the winter too. So our challenge is really more just trying to create a fair and balanced approach on how and when people can use space, as opposed to just making sure it gets utilized.
Sure. I was just concerned that maybe the fees might be discouraging people from using, but it doesn't sound like that's the case. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Now we do fee comparison shopping, make sure that we're in line with other districts in the area. And we have fair but competitive fees for our use.
I just had a maybe comment sort of question. Since we've had some dialogue outside of finance committee meetings around the Aquatic Center, I think it's a great step, first of all, that we're doing in district and out of district pricing for our families. I've looked at other aquatic centers outside of ours, and many of them do the same thing, and they give preference to the taxpayers who are supporting and funding the resource. So I really strongly support that. And along that line, I'm curious, have we posted something to share with our patrons how that's going to be validated? Because I know there really wasn't a lot of clarity when we had similar discussions around this topic in the recent past. So what process is being required to demonstrate you're a district user or resident, I suppose?
I would need to check with Mr. Pryor on that. I can say on ours, as a part of our application process for the district level, we do for the groups that we don't know are part of a district organization or a community organization, we do request rosters from them. So I would assume that on the application, people put in their name, address, and it's just simply verified in that way. But we can ask Mr. Pryor that question.
Yeah,
Okay, I was just curious.
Thank you. And in conversation with Mr. Pryor, we'll be checking driver's licenses, or possibly they can bring in a utility bill or some other verification of residence.
Yeah,
And that's similar to what I think Parks and Recs and other entities.
That's what I was gonna say. Yeah, that's how I think I got my little scan card. So I'm sure it's a pretty easy process and something they could just do one time and then you're validated. But
Exactly.
yeah, I definitely support that, and I hope that same practice is being done on like the teams like we talked about as well. I know the pricing might not reflect difference, but the validation side of it to ensure that our facilities are being maximized by our taxpayers first. So I appreciate that effort. Thank you.
Okay, the next agenda item is the 2020 bond budget update. And this may be the last time we see this. We are currently working to close out as much as the bond expenses. We have just very minimal encumbrance that's open at this point. And so we have actually started to take some of the available bond funding. You'll see a reduction in funding there and just using it to support our capital budget, support capital projects that are needed by the district. And so really don't have anything other to add at this point. I don't know, Nathan, if you'd like to add comments, but I'd be glad to answer any questions if you have them.
I'd just add that when we get to the budget for FY25 next year, we will still show a bond budget and expense, primarily because as Kyle mentioned, we are closing out a lot of the existing projects. However, by June 30th, we don't feel it's feasible to have all of those expended. We may have much more of a significant portion than is presented in the budget tonight expended by June 30th. But that we're just in a wait and see mode. Part of that depends on delivery of equipment. Can we get that out the door by June 30th? But just to reiterate, one of the things that Kyle said initially, it's all Fund 4 expense. And so we are definitely at the phase where we're blending district capital project needs with the completion of all the district projects that were part of that bond. So big picture, it's a good position to be in because we have some available funds to use for projects that are needed, that are regular capital projects.
Ms. Pruitt, would you go to page 4 of this document and the very bottom? And so in the column second to the right, from the right, you're going to see that the remaining budget balance is $926,000, a little over that. And so on this spreadsheet, you can see that seems to be the available funds. A little bit later on in the meeting, Mr. Holder is going to go through our balance sheet, and you're going to see that really what we have in the bank available in our bond funds is just a little over $5 million at the end of May. And so that $5 million number is really what we're spending down. And this budget document has served us well in helping us keep track of our bond expenditures throughout all the projects. But really, truly, now we're just down to all the projects really wrapping up, being done. And then what do we have left? And what we have left as of the end of May is around $5 million. And those funds are going to be spent on capital projects. And as an example, Bernard Campbell mechanical project will, as well as Lee Summit High and Mason Elementary roof. So those are the types of projects that we will spend down these bond funds on. Are there any questions regarding this report or bond expenditures in general? All right, thank you, Mr. Grill. Appreciate it. Moving on to Section 3 Finance, Mr. Holder.
All right, we have quite a few items here on the finance agenda. So the first one is our transfer of funds from Fund 1 to Fund 2. This is the general transfer that we do most months, just about every month, usually except July and sometimes August. So you see the amount there that would be needed for May. Any questions on that? All right, let's jump into the revenue and expense report. So what we're looking at is through May. It is obviously 11 months out of the 12 of our fiscal year. And this very much informs what we do in June with the budget amendment for ending fiscal year 24, which then of course jumps into FY 25. And so as we look at this for May, really we're seeing the realization of quite a few things that we've been talking about as we went through, especially the last few months. If we look at the revenue column, you will see that in our operating fund, we're about 4% behind where we were at this point last year. We know that is almost exclusively due to just the local collection from our properties. We actually have had some other Fund 1 revenues, operating revenues that have exceeded our expectations, but we know that in the local tax collection from Jackson County, we're still about $5 million short of where we hope to be. Now, we still have tomorrow. We still have next Friday, June 28th. We have heard that tomorrow might be larger than it has been in the past few weeks. So we're still very much in a wait and see mode. But when we get to the budget amendment for this year, you'll see the reduction there. Special revenue fund, that's kind of the counterbalance. Unfortunately, it's not quite enough of a counterbalance, but we are trending ahead there. We will continue to trend ahead. When we look at our revenue estimates, we're going to adjust that slightly for June, the end of June. So that is a good thing. I will note, just as we compare to last year, there are some title monies. We have Title I, Title II, Title III, and Title IV monies that we requested. We will actually receive those tomorrow from the state. Last year at this time, we had received those in May. That's about $1.8 million. So in theory, we would be a little bit better in the operating fund and the special revenue fund revenues as we compare year to date for both fiscal years, but it's not in there yet. That will even out as we get to the end of June. Debt service, we know that follows the same trend as our operating fund, and so we will see that lowered a little bit. Bond fund, we continue to collect a little bit of interest in there, and we definitely anticipate wrapping that up. We hope to have that done by the end of June. It does not look like, certainly as we sit here on June 20th, that's going to be possible by June 28th, but certainly by July or the end of August, we anticipate all those bond funds being spent. And then that blends into our capital projects, because remember, on our annual school board report and in the eyes of the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in Missouri, those are all Fund 4 capital project fund expenses, whether they reside in a bond fund or the capital projects fund. We break it out just for simplicity of reporting and making sure that we can show what those bond expenses were for and what the total cost of the project was. But in the eyes of the state, it's actually all the same. So you'll see the revenue there. We are ahead of pace. We've had Strong merchants and manufacturing revenue that we put most of that in Fund 4 in the Capital Projects Fund. And then we also had some of the CNG tax credit that came into there. That was around $400,000 that we weren't anticipating on the original budget. So that's been a benefit to our Capital Projects Fund. And as we'll see as we go through the budget presentations, it's definitely needed, and that has been a good thing. Moving over to the restricted funds, if we look at nutrition services, we know that we're trending lower in revenue. You'll see that adjustment on the budget amendment. Activities are actually trending very close to what we anticipate they would be at the end of June, both in revenues and expenses. And then before and after school is below, but remember, big picture, that is in a positive area. And really what that is reflective of, we receive revenue in before and after school for the rental that the Y pays us to use our facilities. But then we also receive reimbursements on existing employees that are still LSR7 employees. Well, as those employees reduce, then that affects revenue, but it also affects expenses in a positive way. So that's why you'll see on the revenue line and the expense line, we'll end up below where we budgeted in both those areas. So moving down to the expense, when we look at our budget amendment, really we have two competing interests that are affecting the end of our fiscal year. One, we have reduced revenue. Two, we have increased expenses. We know in the operating fund, we know we've been talking about this for several months, that we've been running a little hot in this area. When we look at the budget amendment, our anticipated salaries and benefits, I did bump that up about 1%. But the rest of the expense is really just contracted services and supplies that have been running higher all year. Our estimated operating fund, when we look at that, and we look at the comparison to last year, it's a little under a 2% difference, but that translates pretty much into what our budget amendment is looking at. I feel like our operating fund, when we look at that on the expense side, it's pretty tight. Even with the amendment, we are really trying to track that exactly where it will end up. On the expense side, on special revenue fund, and remember, this is basically all certificated salaries and benefits in our school district, as well as subs with the purchase services. We are amending that. As you look at this, we're not really trending that far above where we were at this point last year. We had a couple things come in May that were a little unique. Some of our summer checks, employees can request to receive instead of a July check, because we normally cut those all by the end of the fiscal year, but they won't receive it in July. But we do offer for them to receive 2 in May and then 1 in June. It's been a long-standing practice that we've had in this district. And so we had an increase in that this year. And so that caused our May expenses to be a little bit higher, as well as recoding an employee that was actually been paid out of the operating fund that should have been paid out of the special revenue fund. So that all hit in May. So that inflated our May a little bit. And so when we look at that amendment, you'll see that that's higher. That probably is conservative. And at the end of the day, I'm hopeful that we'll finish under that estimate, and maybe under enough to move the needle a little bit on our operating reserve. So we look at the debt service fund expense. We did not adjust that. We aren't adjusting that as part of the budget amendment. So we're looking good there. The bond, as I said, we're not going to be able to, we don't anticipate being able to spend all of those funds. So we'll carry over what we don't. And then capital projects, we're looking to be a little bit under. We were able to adjust that number down a little bit in the capital projects fund for the budget. Moving over to nutrition services. Again, this is an area where our revenue wasn't what we expected, but our expenses are also should finish below what we anticipated as well. So there's a little bit of a counterbalance that, but we will deficit spend in the nutrition services fund. We did anticipate that going into this year. Last year was skewed a little bit by some revenue that we received in July that we should have received in June. So that is all evened out. And we'll have a pretty good picture of where we're at as we end this fiscal year and kind of what we need to look at going forward. But we do have a good balance in our nutrition services fund as well. Activities, again, really lining up. I will tell you, because it's June 20th and this is run through May 31st, our activity expenses have ticked up a little bit, but are still under the budget, but they're a little bit closer to where our revenues are. We're still running about $100,000 ahead in revenue. That fund is not meant to build revenue in. It is really an in and out because those are activity funds. And we know with the foundation, there's a true up every year that happens. So that always is same revenue in, same expense out. Activity will fluctuate. And there could be years where expenses are a little higher than revenues. But again, we're not meant to build fund balances there. It's just an estimate of what those will be on a yearly basis. And then before and after school, we continue to make good progress. As we go down, you'll see we still have a negative balance, but where we are at this year compared to where we were last year is much improved. And we'll continue to monitor that, and we should make good progress. And that won't stop at the end of the fiscal year. That will continue into the next fiscal year. Our current fund balance, you'll see that we are a little bit lower, just under $3 million lower than we were at this point last year. Again, that really tracks with everything that we just discussed up top, and that will have some impact on our ending fund balance. But overall, again, we're still very healthy in comparison. Any questions on the revenue and expense report? All right, if we move to the investment report, there's really not a lot to highlight there other than it's just worth mentioning that as we look at June, we did have an agency come off. We also had a CD that just expired yesterday. We went ahead and requested the CD to come back to us. We are looking to reinvest the agency in a treasury, either at the end of this month. We may even wait till July. The 3-year and 2-year treasuries come out on the middle of the month and at the end of the month, respectively. So as we look at this, the main thing I'd like to point out is as we look at next fiscal year, you see one investment that was a short-term investment that we're receiving 5% on. It expires August of 24. All the other ones that expire, with the exception of one CD that on March 17th of 25, we have significant opportunity with our investments at UBS. So that's a good thing. We know that our short-term liquid, which really is still king, you can get a little bit higher if you go out with some term, 60 and 90 days, which we will likely do after July 1st. You can get a little bit higher investment, but our liquid is actually, you can get more in liquid right now than you can in a 2, 3, or even 5-year investment, which is somewhat rare, but we know it's been that way for several months. But we'll continue to monitor that. The bottom line is next 12 months, we do have some opportunities, even with if the Fed drops interest rates, which we anticipate they will, at least once or twice next fiscal year, we're still in good shape as we replace these investments. All right, if we move on to the balance sheet. I'm sorry, were there any questions on the investment report? I forgot to ask. All right, if we look at the balance sheet, really is two things I'd like to highlight here. One, if you look at our capital projects fund in the middle of the page, if you go all the way down, you'll see that at about $4.8 million. Just keep in mind That is before the transfer that we're making, $6 million. There will be more expense than revenue that comes out in June, but we still anticipate our capital projects fund balance being above 10 million after the transfer. As we look at our bond capital fund, that's what Dr. Shelton referred to earlier. You see that just over $5 million there. That is what, as we get to June 30th, there is a possibility that that number is cut in half. I have it estimated at 4.5 million. It just depends on what we are able to really receive and bill out as it relates to capital projects really in the next 6 days, because June 28th is the last business day of the fiscal year. Either way, those funds, whatever the balance is in those two funds, capital projects and bond capital, as we move into FY25, yes, there will be a little bit of retainage that's still left that we're paying out on actual bond projects in July. Certainly hope to get that wrapped up in August, but there could be punch list items that linger. But we will move fairly quickly to expend all of those bond funds within July or August, and then have that blend into the capital projects fund. Any questions on the balance sheet? All right, let's jump into our amendment. So we have two items tonight. And as I go through these at the board meeting, really I'll follow the same pattern. So we have the agenda items, but yeah, go ahead, Hannah, if you'll click on the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint really encompasses both items. And so what you have on the amending the 23-24 budget, we have the actual budget amendment, the one-page summary, and then we also have this presentation. On the FY25 budget, you have the one-page summary. We also have the budget book, which I do want to apologize. I had that done. I sent it out Tuesday, but it was just before 7 o'clock Tuesday night. That did not get uploaded till this morning, but the 60-page larger document, that is loaded now. And then also this presentation is loaded too. So again, the one-pagers are really the summaries for FY25. That's more of a detailed, but this PowerPoint really, the hope is, and I think it does, it encompasses really the summary of how we're ending this fiscal year and then what it looks like for next year. So if we go to the second slide there, Hannah, yeah. So just a reminder, for the budget amendment, we're actually not required to amend revenues. The only legal requirement in the state of Missouri is that your actual expenses should not exceed your budgeted expenses. In Lee Summit, we have traditionally amended with an estimate, and then the goal is that those expenses don't exceed. I know in my past experiences, we amended to actual. So where it ended up is where the amendment was. As I have mentioned in the past, if we had to come back in July and make an adjustment, we could do that. But the goal is at the June meeting that we amend our expense budget and so that our actual expenses do not exceed it. And these are projected through June 30th. So anything that hits through June 28th, realistically, next Friday, is on this fiscal year. Our operating fund, I am monitoring that very closely. I do think we're close there. I tried to hit that pretty close to where I think we'll end up the fiscal year. The special revenue fund, the teacher expenses, I do feel like as we've received more information in June and we were able to go back and look at May, there were some extenuating circumstances at May that I'm cautiously optimistic that I think our Fund 2 expenses may be a little bit high. And so as things shake out at the end of June, it may improve our picture a little bit. And just a reminder, all the fund balances that you see here are unaudited. They're going to be right in the ballpark, but occasionally, there may be an expense that the auditor will say, really that probably didn't need to be a capital expense, or that should have been a capital expense, or you may find something that was expensed in operating that really should have been special revenue. It will not change our bottom line at all. It can just impact what fund it is spent out of. All right. So if we look at slide 3, these are the revenue changes, and you'll really see what we've talked about previously. You see all of the funds there listed. When we combine operating, which is the combination of incidental and our teachers fund, and teachers fund, I always should mention here, we use these terms interchangeably. Incidental, we call incidental. We also call it operating, and we call it Fund 1. All the 3 of those things are the same. Teachers fund, also referred to as the special revenue fund, as well as Fund 2. I commonly say Fund 1 and Fund 2. Just over many years, that's how I look at it. But so you will see that those used a little bit interchangeably. But when you look at both of those, Fund 1 and Fund 2, those are both considered operating. And so that's why we combine when we look at the revenue. If you look at what we're amending to, which we're not required to do, but we like to just to give a general sense of where the revenue is. We are looking at going down in our incidental about $2.2 million. Fund 2, the teachers fund, going up just over $500,000. The combination of that is a reduction of about $1.67 million in revenue, and then just over 0.5% of a reduction. The bulk of that, though, is that $5 million. So what that means is, yes, we did exceed revenue projections in some other areas, but instead of being over budget projections by $3.5 million, we're actually under because of that in Jackson County. Capital projects were over. We know I discussed really the 2 primary reasons for that, with merchants and manufacturing revenue, as well as the CNG rebate. Debt service, we're under. Again, that aligns really closely with the incidental fund. And that will rise and fall with the last 2 weeks that we have in the collection. Restricted is down quite a bit. There's really 2 primary reasons for that. One, food service revenue. And that just is a little lower than we anticipated. And then BAS. Again, we anticipated it to be a little bit higher, but as employees have dropped off of the LSR7, that affects the revenue received. We left the activity fund alone, but those are the primary reasons. Just keep in mind that you'll also see a reduction in restricted funds on the expense side as well. And then bond, you see we exceeded that a little bit. Our goal was to have that spent by the end of June, but we certainly hope to get that out of the door in the next 2 months. So we again, we'll end up a little bit higher than what we budgeted in January. All right, if we look at expenses, and really the combination of these 2, that's the next slide. You'll see a variance there in both incidental and teacher, where we are raising the expense budget. In the incidental fund, we're looking at $2.44 million. That is, again, primarily due to supplies and purchase services. And we've watched this fund, and we knew over the last few months that this would be, we would have to raise this. The actual salary and benefits we think are trending pretty well. I did bump it up just over 1%. In the incidental, to try to capture that, but the majority is really related to supplies and purchase services. As we look at the teachers fund, you'll notice as well that went up just over 1.5%. That is primarily a conservative estimate for salaries and benefits. I hope and expect that will not be quite as high. What is higher and was raised just over $500,000 from 4.9 to 5.4 or 5.5 is the purchase services. That's largely due to subs, and not necessarily because our absentee rate is higher, but a lot of trainings, a lot of things that were happening this year that were scheduled. And as those have come in, we just had to raise our budget a little bit in that area. So those two things are really the only two factors that affect expenses in Fund 2. And so you'll see that. My hope is certainly that we'll be under that, but again, trying to be in a position where we don't have to come back in July, especially in Fund 2. Hopefully we're a little bit conservative and a little bit high there. Capital funds, we did drop that just over $800,000. It looks like our expenses should come in actually probably a little under 21 million is what it's looking at as of today. But we feel good about that amount. Debt service, not making an adjustment there on the expenditure budget. That looks to be tracking just fine. And then restricted, you'll notice that again, we dropped revenue, we dropped restricted expense, not as much as we dropped the revenue, but we did still lower that down. That's another area that we're watching pretty closely. It could be pretty tight, but most of restricted falls under incidental as well when you look at the ASBR. So, between the two, we're hopeful that we'll be in good shape. And then the bond fund, you just see the reduction there to reflect what we think we'll actually spend in Fund 4. All right. So all of those pages, or the two slides really that we had, what does that mean? And when you look at this, so this will be our what we hope is our final amendment tonight. You see there the impact, and you see our beginning balance where it started and our ending balance. Those are both highlighted in yellow, and you see that reduction there. Again, it's a combination of really two things. Yes, revenue is the big driver of that, but then also some expenses really in operating that were higher than what we anticipated that they would be. And you're hopeful that, because sometimes expenses will run a little bit more than expected, especially in incidental. And the hope is always that, the revenue will balance it out a little bit. And this year really the opposite. So it's a bit of a double whammy in that expenses ran a little bit higher there. And then revenues, not only, they didn't come in any higher, they actually came in a little bit lower. And so when you look at the combination of those two things, you see that drop. So overall, not what we hope for, certainly not even what we hoped for in January, but there are definitely some extenuating circumstances this year that over time, next year, 2 years, 3 years down the road should even out. So if you drop down to the next slide, you'll see just a comparison there. We have had an operating fund balance above 30% for quite some time. We dropped below for 3 years there from FY19 to FY21. We came back up. ESSER had definitely had an impact on FY22 and FY23, and then you see that drop. We're still above 25%, which is our CSIP stated goal. Certainly if you go back to 9-10, you can see balances there in the teens. We would not want to get back to that situation. But 27 is where we anticipate. And this is really a unique year. it could be lower slightly. It's not going to be much lower than that. It could be higher. And a lot of that depends on really what happens from a revenue standpoint in the next 2 weeks. That it's just uncertainty. And normally we do not have that type of uncertainty at this point in the year. We know we'll get just a little bit from county, and we're not even really counting on that for revenue. This year's just a little different in that. So 27.38 is really, again, we're not going to go way below that. It's not going to go way up either, but there could definitely be a little bit of a variance, and we're hopeful that it can end up a little bit higher, especially if the special revenue fund 2 expenses come in lower than what we have budgeted. All right, so as we look ahead to FY25, just some key pieces of the budget. Go ahead to the next slide. We'll just look at revenue and expenses, just big picture here. Assessed value, we're anticipating that's flat for 2 reasons. One, we predict that existing properties are going to reduce a little bit because of protests that were not settled in time when they gave us our final certification in early September. But we anticipate that we will have new construction that comes on that will remain higher or will increase it. And so overall, we anticipate that it will remain pretty close to where it is now. Maybe a little lower, could be a little higher. Prop C is helping us. That is budgeted at $1,500 per ADA. The actual estimate from the state right now is $1,515. That's higher than last year. Our state revenue is up, and our federal will be a little bit lower, but we are buoyed by state revenue. And really, I should probably take out the word slightly, because it's up next year and should be up based on the change in the basic formula. So really, there's 3 areas that are helping our revenue next year. The basic formula, which we anticipate being higher and helping make up for a little bit of the drop in ADA, because we were using 1920 school year ADA because of the pandemic provision. Prop C helps us. That should be higher than what it was this year. And then assessed valuation, any new construction, any increase in personal property, we will capture that. So it does not help us near as much as it would normally or in a reassessment year, but that we anticipate a little bit of an increase. Those are really the 3 main factors that are driving our anticipated increase in revenue. We do have, going down to federal there, we just have a little bit of money left, about $750,000 that we will be capturing next fiscal year as we end up ESSER 3, teacher retention grant, those things, the last pieces that we couldn't get in on this fiscal year because you can't request those until you've expensed everything. So if you look at where our revenue comes from, we know local is the biggest piece. It's over 2/3 now of our revenue. State, 26.8, that's actually a little bit higher than it was last year because of the increase in the formula. Federal is down because we've really received most of the ARP money, the ESSER monies over the last 3 fiscal years. So the federal is more in line with what we would normally expect, little less than 4% if we weren't getting that little bit of money from ESSER still. And then county, typical, it's between 1% and 2% of our revenue. If we look at the expense, what drives the increased expenses on the next slide? Really the salary schedule movement, the additions for all of those salary schedules, that's the primary driver. When we look at supplies and purchase services through our budgeting, really staying, when you combine those, very close to what they were this year, anticipated. So really the salary increases are the main driver of increased expense. Benefits, we did look to increase that 1.5% just remember that, and that's the health insurance board paid premium. That only hits the second half of, that should say the 24-25 school year. I apologize for that. But that just hits the second half because it doesn't go into effect till January of 2025. And the board will actually approve that at our August meeting. So it is an estimate, but we feel pretty good that it'll be in line with that. The retirement contributions, which for school districts are not insignificant, they are a large part of the budget. Those are remaining the same. So we won't, the only increase we see there is just an increase in salaries, not because the contribution percentage went up. We are still including a transfer of $5 million. We kept this year at $6 million. We could have lowered that this year and our fund balances would be a little higher. Could do the same for 24-25, but we continue to be fairly aggressive in our capital projects, and I feel pretty confident saying that it's needed. We have some things that need to be done, and so in order to do those, you have to also make a transfer into our capital projects fund. So we're just reducing that by $1 million, but that you'll see even with the $5 million transfer, our capital projects fund will be lowered quite a bit from the beginning balance. The next slide is just our expenses on a total level. Now this is all our expenses. So this includes our bond fund, our debt service, materials, supplies, purchase services. If you take out capital projects and lease purchase payments and general obligation debt, we spend 82% of our operating funds on salaries and benefits. When you look at our total expense budget, you'll see next year we 67.87. If you look at total expenses, that will vary from year to year, just because you may have a year where, the last 2 years are great examples. We had a lot of bond expense. So that will skew that a little bit when you look at your total overall budget. But again, that's a snapshot of where we would anticipate being in FY25. Related to debt service, as we look at a potential bond issue in 2025 on the next slide, you just see the schedule that we have there. This is also included in the larger budget book in a couple different places. This is just all the debt that we have as it lays out. What you're looking at is next fiscal year's payment on the top two rows. And then as we go down, you'll see exactly where we're at. There is a possibility we may consider, you see that 2016, there's still some principal there. We made a large $19 million prepayment this year. You could see that come down. We may consider doing that again this fiscal year. It's not in the budget right now, so if we decide to do that, we'll make an amendment as it relates to debt service. But this really drives, what our ability, what we can borrow in 2025. So the next slide, you'll see again the one-page summary, which I think really summarizes pretty succinctly both our revenues, where they're coming from, the expenses, and you'll see that we are projecting and we are focusing on budgeting for a balanced budget. Even though our fund balance percentage would come down just slightly, we would project to add $413,000, almost $414,000 into the operating. Now, the caveat, which I'm pretty confident of, but the caveat is, of course, local tax collection. We projected a surplus this year, but we didn't receive our revenues. Now we know that this year is pretty unique, but I do feel much more confident, barring some unforeseen circumstance, that we should be able to finish up FY25 in a much more balanced fashion than we did this year. this is preliminary. There's still a lot of things that we'll find out between now and our tax rate hearing in September, including what our assessed valuation is. And that's really the key driver. State estimates should remain the same between now and then. Federal will remain the same between now and then. But really, it's going to be on that local assessed valuation, and we'll see where that ends up, and then that will the amendment that we approve in September will be we'll have that key piece of information with it. All right, that's a lot of information. I know this is a lot more than we normally do, and really, what you just heard is very much a preview of tonight. But are there any questions as relates to either the 23-24 amendment or the 24-25 budget?
I have some question, Mr. Holder. Going back to when you were talking about the $5 million additional expense related to contract services. So is that $5 million increase then rolled over as a potential budgeted increase that was added for 24-25? Like, we're expecting that amount to continue, or are we considering that some kind of unexpected fluke this year that won't recur next year?
So a lot of it is one time. If you go back, Hannah, to probably slide 5. Yeah. So if we look at that, contracted services were budgeted at 26.9, and the increase, I'm sorry, we're budgeted to end the fiscal year at 26.9. If we look at January, it was 24,075. So it's just under $3 million of the increase. Much of that is one time. We had different projects, especially as it related to technology. We had some technology expenses that we anticipated possibly being capital or supply, but ended up being in contracted services. So part of that will carry over. Part of that is related to some of the utilities, which hits both supplies and contracted services. But that is an area that we should, if we go down, so you see 26.9 and 25.24, and then if you go down, Hannah, to slide 10-ish, no, one down, one more, up, another one, sorry. It's the 24-25 version of that. You'll see that we're actually projecting contracted services to be a little bit lower and supplies to be a little bit higher. Those, a lot of times that can be a function of where items are budgeted. And as we get into September, we may adjust that a little bit. The total will probably not be adjusted, but the line item of where it is would be adjusted. For instance, if you look at the teachers fund, you'll see that our contracted services there at the end of this fiscal year was higher than what we've budgeted for next fiscal year. And that's largely due to training. A lot of the things that we did this year, not that we won't be doing that next year, but we don't anticipate that to be quite so high with some of our professional development monies. So things like that will impact it looking forward.
And we get a certain amount of money from the state for PD, right? Isn't there something that's earmarked for that?
We do. We have to spend 1% of our basic formula, which we had some of that restricted. We had carryover this year. I do anticipate a little bit of carryover next year, but we're working on that to make sure that we spend that, and that can fit into that. Subs will affect that. There are other expenses too that go into that, but yes, it can.
Okay. I know we'll probably talk more about this at the board meeting. Just me, I'm a little bit concerned just overall with this year and next year with the pending litigation with Jackson County and our ending fund balance being, I mean, the lowest it's been in what, since 2008, and it's only projected to slightly decline, and that's probably best case scenario if there is no adverse action that comes out of that lawsuit. So I'm a little concerned, and I don't know, I'm sure the full board can have some conversation around that, but I'm just curious if there's been any planning, just contingency planning, for potential cost cutting measures if there is a bad outcome and, we need to kind of, in the interim, while recovering, tighten things up. Is that something that we're talking about?
Most definitely. It is on our minds. And really there's two things that play into that. One is exactly what you mentioned. We don't know what the outcome of the current suit will be, or even when that could take effect. There is the potential there that it's a one-time hit. We do have the balances and reserves to absorb that for 1 year, which is really what it would be, because the impact of that is that the levy will go back up quite a bit if assessed valuations are rolled back. So that is a 1 year hit. But the second piece of it is, and this is something that we talk about quite a bit and has come into focus, is we're not, we have to be mindful of where we sit, and our enrollment is flat. We have benefited from an increase in the state formula. We have benefited from the last assessed valuation increase, but we have really, any benefit that we've received from that, we have put into our expense budget. We haven't really held any back. And so we do have to be mindful, I think, going forward, when we add, and that's not to say that we won't add things and do things differently or have a program that comes in. But I think we also have to have the mindset that if we do that, what is going to come off the table? Because we're not in a situation where we can just keep adding, but yet keep everything that we have.
Yes, agreed.
So that is, and Lee Summit's been in a growth pattern for so long, and then it stopped. But when it stopped, then the ESSER money came in. And so really we are at the end of the road there. And we do have healthy resources. It's just that we are in a position where we're going to have to make some choices going forward. And so looking at it through that mindset, and yes, those are discussions that we have almost on a daily basis, and certainly a weekly basis as we look at it going forward.
So ahead of the meeting, my ask would be, just so we could have a little bit more in-depth conversation, is what kinds of things are we looking at? Like, how are we approaching prioritizing the things that are must-haves? We have to figure out how to do it, and what are just wants, and how we are going through that process in the coming year, at least, to really get a handle on what we can afford and what we should be moving forward with, and just having a better understanding of how we're doing that, if that's by department or what's going on with that. Just, it would help me in the conversation, because that's something I kind of want to know a little bit more about, but I think it would be beneficial for the rest of the board to have the opportunity to hear that. And I'm not sure that everybody's going to have time to watch this meeting ahead of, since it's the same day as the board meeting. It's getting rather long. So I just want to make sure we're able to have that conversation with the full board, and they get the opportunity to hear some of that as well. So I don't want to ask too many more questions, but that type of thing would be helpful this evening.
Yes, we can certainly be prepared to talk about that. And that does touch a lot of different areas, but we can work with Dr. Shelton and have that discussion and be prepared.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Mr. Holder, thank you. Any additional comments before we move on to section 4? All right, thank you. Moving on to section 4, 4.01, future agenda items. You have a list here of items that you'll see on today's agenda, but also in the months to come. So these are just here for your awareness. Please know that administratively, our staff is working as you know, as you've watched us work over the last few years. It does take months in some cases to bring these items forward. So in many cases, we have begun the work on these items and we'll bring these forward in the coming months. Moving on to item 4.02, summer 2024 projects. This was a list that we developed earlier this spring, and it's an ever-changing list. Things come on, things come off based on availability of funds. As Mr. Holder mentioned, our current capital budget as well as our future capital budget will address some of these needs. Based on availability of funds, some of these items won't be able to be done, and so. But we just provide this as, once again, as an awareness of the list, at least a preliminary list of projects that we had planned to do, some of which will be done, some of which will need to be delayed and deferred until a later date. Are there any questions about that agenda item or any other agenda items that we've covered so far? Because that brings us to the end of our meeting. Not hearing any questions, we will conclude today's meeting. And as a reminder, our regular board meeting is tonight. We have a work session that I believe begins at 5, then a regular session that begins at 7 o'clock. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sheldon.